Behind every crown, there's a story no one...
Power isn't just in the throne. Sometimes it whispers from the shadows.
Every secret, every whisper, can change a kingdom.
Hey guys, tonight we begin behind a door that was rarely truly closed. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket up just a little higher, and let your mind drift back to a time when the most powerful decisions in Europe were sometimes made not in council chambers, but in candlelit beds. We are not here for scandal in the loud, dramatic sense. No shouting, no dramatic music. Just is low, steady realization that throughout history, the royal bedroom was less about romance and more about strategy, with silk curtains. Because when you are a monarch, love is rarely private. It is diplomatic. It is calculated, it is observant, and occasionally it is wildly inconvenient. The bed was not simply furniture, it was policy, it was alliance. It was a genetic gamble wrapped in embroidered velvet, and sometimes it was a stage where affection and ambition politely tried not to trip over each other. Let's begin in France with Louis XIV, the Sun King, who believed many things revolved around him. He was not shy about it. Versailles itself was essentially a monument to his own reflection, and in the royal bedchamber, that confidence did not dim. Louis married Maria Theresa of Spain, a political alliance that tied two powerful houses together. It was practical, necessary, predictable. Romance was not the primary objective. Of course, it wasn't. But Louis also maintained official Yes, official, as in acknowledged, recognized, practically given job descriptions. One of the most famous was Madame de Monte, intelligent, witty, and ambitious. She held enormous influence at court. The king's affection translated into political access. Access translated into power. Courtiers understood that if you wanted something done, sometimes you did not go through a minister. You went through the woman sharing the king's pillow. Now, imagine the atmosphere. Versailles glittering with chandeliers, the king performing his nightly kucha ritual, where nobles watched him prepare for bed. Yes, watched. Privacy was optional. Ceremony was mandatory. After the crowd withdrew, behind those grand doors, personal relationships continued shaping public decisions. It is strangely calming to think that major policy shifts might have begun with a quiet, late-night conversation beneath brocade canopies. Let's float over to England and meet Charles II. A king who returned to the throne after years of exile and decided, quite reasonably in his mind, that he deserved to enjoy himself. Charles had numerous Nell Gwyn, for instance, began as an actress and became one of his most beloved companions. She was clever, sharp-tongued, and refreshingly informal in a court that often took itself too seriously. Charles fathered many illegitimate children, officially acknowledged, given titles, raised within aristocratic circles. The royal bedroom expanded the royal family tree in ways that were both affectionate and politically complicated. Parliament occasionally sighed collectively, but Charles maintained his charm, because sometimes charisma smooths over dynastic irregularities. Meanwhile, his queen, Catherine of Braganza, navigated a quieter existence. Their marriage was an alliance between England and Portugal. She brought tea to England, which is perhaps her most lasting contribution. She did not produce a surviving heir, and so the king's mistresses filled the emotional and dynastic gaps. The bed, again, became a place where expectation and reality politely disagreed. Now let's drift back a bit further to the Habsburgs, because when discussing royal intimacy, we cannot ignore a family tree that occasionally resembled a carefully braided circle. The Habsburgs preferred to marry within their own extended family to preserve power. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. Because why not double down on dynastic unity? Philip II of Spain married 4 times. His 4th wife, Anna of Austria, was his niece. This was not considered particularly unusual within Habsburg logic. The goal was territorial stability. The side effect was genetic concentration. Over generations, this strategy produced rulers like Charles II of Spain, whose health struggles were widely noted. The royal bedroom had become both a political tool and, unintentionally, a medical experiment. But let's keep the tone gentle. The reality for these individuals was often less scandalous and more quietly tragic. Marriages were arranged in childhood, brides traveled across continents. Language barriers lingered. A teenage princess might arrive in a foreign court, meet her husband for the first time, and understand that her primary responsibility was to produce heirs, preferably quickly. Take Marie Antoinette, married to Louis XVI. At 1414, she entered a court obsessed with ritual and image. Their marriage was awkward in its early years, consummation reportedly delayed. Europe whispered impatiently, pamphlets speculated, and inside the grand bedchamber at Versailles, beneath layers of ceremony, two young people navigated expectation with varying degrees of confusion. When children finally arrived, relief washed through the court. The bed had fulfilled its duty. But even then, public scrutiny did not fade. Marie Antoinette's reputation became entangled with rumors of affairs, some exaggerated, some politically motivated. The royal bedroom was never just personal space. It was a rumor factory with Let's gently step into Russia and consider Catherine the Great. Intelligent, strategic, and unapologetically ambitious. Her marriage to Peter III was strained from the beginning. Peter was erratic, immature, and deeply unpopular. Catherine, meanwhile, cultivated relationships that were both personal and political. Several of her close companions became influential figures at court. Was affection involved? Likely. Was power involved? Absolutely. Absolutely. Catherine understood that alliances were not limited to treaties. Trust, loyalty, and companionship could shape governance. Her bedroom was not merely a place of indulgence, it was a chamber of influence. A space where loyalty was forged as carefully as any law. And then there is Henry VIII. Of course there is. A man who treated marriage like a strategic board game with increasingly impatient moves. Catherine of Aragon, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr. Each marriage began with promise and ended with complication. The royal bed was central to it all. The desperate pursuit of a male heir overshadowed every relationship. Anne Boleyn, sharp and charismatic, held Henry's attention 4 years before marriage. She influenced religious shifts that reshaped England, all beginning with a king unwilling to accept papal refusal. The personal became theological. The bedroom dispute became a national transformation. It is almost impressive how much could unravel from one man's determination to secure a son. Throughout all these stories, one pattern remained steady. The royal bedroom was rarely quiet, in consequence. Love might exist there. Lust certainly did. But power always lingered nearby, adjusting the pillows. And as we settle into the soft glow of candlelight in these imagined chambers, notice how human these figures remain. They worried about affection, about legitimacy, about reputation, about heirs who might or might not survive infancy. The stakes were enormous. The setting was plush. We are visiting the apartments of the royal mistress, the woman without a crown, and occasionally without patience. In many European courts, the king's mistress was not a secret. She was practically an institution. In France especially, the title maîtresse en titre carried real weight. It meant access, influence, proximity, and proximity, as history repeatedly proves, is power wrapped in perfume. Let's return briefly to Louis XIV, because he did not do anything halfway. His mistress, Madame de Montespan, was not merely a companion. She was dazzling, sharp-minded, socially dominant. She bore the king several children, many of whom he legitimized, which meant they were recognized. Granted titles, folded carefully into the royal structure like decorative embroidery that no one mentioned too loudly. Montespan's apartments at Versailles were luxurious. She received petitions. Courtiers sought her favor. Ambassadors noted her opinions. If she approved of you, doors opened. If she did not, well, Versailles had many cold corridors. Her influence over appointments and policy was subtle but real. And all of it flowed from the simple fact that the king preferred her company at night. But influence in silk slippers is never entirely secure. Eventually, Louis's attention drifted to Madame de She began as governess to his illegitimate children.com/pious, reserved. Quite the contrast to Montespan's, and slowly, quietly, she became indispensable. Maintenon did not flaunt her power. She did not dazzle ballrooms. Instead, she offered steadiness, counsel, religious devotion, and when Queen Maria Theresa died, Louis secretly married Maintenon in what was known as a morganatic marriage, meaning she would never be queen. No crown, no official recognition of equal rank, just a king's private commitment. And yet, her influence deepened. Policies became more conservative. Court culture shifted subtly. Tikin, and beside him stood a woman who technically had no formal authority, but whose opinions shaped the rhythm of governance. It is almost peaceful to imagine them in quiet evening conversation. France's direction, adjusting slightly between sips of wine. Now let's gently cross the English Channel again, because England had its own fascinating tradition of powerful Charles II, as we've mentioned, was particularly enthusiastic in this department. One of his most influential companions was Barbara Villars, Duchess of Cleveland, fiery, assertive, politically engaged. Barbara did not pretend to be modest. She leveraged her closeness to the king openly. She secured titles for herself and her children. She advocated for allies, and she acquired wealth with impressive efficiency. Parliament grumbled, of course, but Charles rarely denied her requests. There's something oddly steady about the pattern. A king seeks affection. A woman offers companionship. In return, she gains influence. And soon, foreign diplomats are carefully observing which salon she prefers for afternoon gatherings. Then we have Nell Gwynn, the actress with sharp wit and theatrical charm. Unlike Barbara's aristocratic presence, Nell's appeal lay in her warmth and humor. She famously diffused anti-Catholic mobs by declaring she was the Protestant whore. Efficient crisis management. Really, Nell did not maneuver politically with the same intensity. Her influence was subtle, but she remained beloved by the king and, surprisingly, by much of the public. She humanized Charles, which, in a monarchy, can be strategically valuable. Let's drift northward now, into Sweden. King Erik XIV fell deeply in love with Karin Mansdotter, not a noble woman, not a foreign princess, simply Karin. Their relationship shocked the aristocracy, because kings were not supposed to marry for love. They were supposed to marry for land. Yet Erik did marry her, and crowned her queen. Briefly his reign, however, was unstable. Political tensions mounted, mental strain increased, and eventually he was deposed. Karin's rise from commoner to queen and back into quiet exile is a gentle reminder that royal affection can elevate and just as swiftly evaporate. Now let's float eastward again to Russia, where Catherine the Great's personal relationships were interwoven with governance in remarkably pragmatic ways. Catherine had several favorites over the course of her reign. Gregory Orlov helped her seize the throne. Later came Gregory Potemkin, perhaps her most enduring partner. Potemkin was not merely a companion. He was a statesman, a military leader, a builder of cities. Some historians even suspect they secretly married. Their relationship evolved into something layered. Romantic at first, then strategic, then enduringly collaborative. Catherine understood loyalty. She rewarded it generously. Estates, titles, wealth. But she also maintained control. When a favorite's influence waned, she transitioned them out gently, often with comfortable pensions. It was surprisingly orderly. The Russian court learned to accept this rhythm. A new favorite would emerge. Policies might shift slightly. Life continued. What makes these stories strangely soothing is their predictability. Human desire colliding softly with institutional power. The bedroom door closes. The council chamber door opens. And sometimes the same conversation echoes in both rooms. But let's not imagine that these women always enjoyed easy lives. Jealousy simmered. Rivalries formed. A new beauty at court could signal political decline. Maintaining favor required intelligence, emotional awareness, and constant adaptation. It was not simply romance. It was survival within silk-lined walls. And consider the emotional toll. To be loved, yet never legitimate. To hold influence, yet lack formal recognition. To shape decisions, yet remain vulnerable to a shift in affection. The royal mistress lived in a paradox. Elevated, but precarious. Even beyond Europe, similar dynamics unfolded. In the Ottoman Empire, the imperial harem functioned as both domestic and political sphere. Women within the sultan's inner circle wielded substantial influence. The Sultanate of women in the 16th and 17th centuries saw powerful consorts and mothers of sultans guide state affairs. Advice offered in private chambers carried weight in imperial decrees. It is easy to reduce these relationships to gossip, but they were deeply structural. Monarchies concentrated authority in one person. Whoever had emotional access to that person inevitably shaped outcomes. So, as we settle back into the soft quiet of our imaginary palace corridor, notice how consistent the pattern remains. Crowns glitter publicly, but influence often whispers privately. The official queen provided legitimacy, dynastic continuity. International alliance, the mistress, meanwhile, provided intimacy. Counsel, immediate trust. Sometimes rivalry brewed between the two. Sometimes a weary truce prevailed. Sometimes, surprisingly, friendship emerged. And through it all, the monarchy continued its slow, candlelit dance. Policies drafted, wars considered. Alliances negotiated with a faint echo of private conversations beneath velvet canopies. We are talking about royal marriages that were political masterpieces on paper and deeply uncomfortable in reality. Arranged marriages were not unusual. In fact, they were the standard operating procedure. Love was optional. Land was not. So, when two kingdoms needed peace, or money, or influence, a wedding was arranged. The bride might be the groom might be 30. Or baise besa. No one blinked. It was diplomacy with lace sleeves. Let's start with one of the most famously awkward unions in English history, Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. Now, at first, this marriage was actually warm. They wrote affectionate letters. They shared intellectual interests. It was almost sweet. But sweetness in royal life is often fragile. Catherine endured multiple pregnancies that did not result in surviving sons, and Henry, as we gently know, really wanted a male heir. Desperately, almost obsessively, because apparently daughters were charming but politically inconvenient. As years passed and no healthy son survived infancy, Henry's affection cooled. Catherine remained dignified. Devout, loyal Henry, however, began eyeing and suddenly, the marriage that once seemed stable became a theological crisis. Because instead of accepting disappointment quietly, Henry decided to challenge the authority of the Pope. Because why not double down? The result was England's break from Rome. All because a king's marriage was not producing the outcome he wanted. Now, let's float to France. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, two teenagers married to strengthen the alliance between France and Austria. She was 14. He was 15, which already suggests that maturity might not be leading the conversation. For several years, the marriage was not consummated. Courtiers whispered. Diplomats reported. Europe watched their bedroom with uncomfortable fascination. It appears Louis struggled with either physical or psychological hesitation. Possibly both doctors were consulted. Advice was offered, and Marie Antoinette endured public scrutiny over something intensely private. Eventually, the marriage was consummated. Children followed, but the early awkwardness lingered in public perception. The Queen became a symbol of excess and foreign influence, which, in revolutionary France, was not ideal branding. Now drift southward to Spain. Philip II married Mary, the First of England. Mary was deeply committed to restoring Catholicism. Philip was the son of the powerful Habsburg emperor. The match was politically strategic, but emotionally distant. Philip spent much of his time abroad. Mary longed for affection and desperately hoped for pregnancy. At one point she believed she was expecting a child. The court prepared. The kingdom anticipated an heir, but it was a phantom pregnancy. The quiet heartbreak of that realization must have been immense. Mary's health declined. Philip remained detached. Their marriage, forged for religious alliance, never blossomed into companionship. And when Mary died, Philip returned to Spain. The alliance dissolved into memory. Let's glide to the Habsburgs now, because if we are discussing dynastic awkwardness, we cannot ignore them. The Habsburg family tree is less a tree and more a tightly folded wreath. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces, because maintaining pure bloodlines was apparently more important than genetic diversity. Take Charles II of Spain. Poor Charles, he suffered from numerous physical and developmental challenges, largely attributed to generations of inbreeding. His jaw was pronounced, his health was fragile. He struggled to produce an heir. His marriage to Maria Louisa of Orleans was strained not by cruelty, but by biology. They remained childless. The dynasty weakened. Europe white. When Charles died without issue, it triggered the War of Spanish Succession, a geopolitical earthquake that began, quietly enough, in a troubled royal bedroom. Now, let's drift to Russia again. Peter III and Catherine the Great. Their marriage was arranged to secure alliances, but emotionally, it was a mismatch. Peter admired Prussia perhaps more than his own country. Catherine, meanwhile, was intelligent, ambitious, observant. Their relationship was distant, cold. Each pursued other companions. Catherine eventually orchestrated a coup that removed Peter from the throne. It is difficult to maintain marital harmony when one partner replaces the other as ruler. Yet what is striking is how common emotional distance was. Royal couples often lived parallel lives, separate apartments, separate routines, shared public appearances, shared heirs, ideally. But intimacy, that was optional. Let's float briefly to the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Constantine VI married Maria of Amnia. The union was arranged by his mother, Empress Irene. Because of course, it was. Maria bore daughters. Constantine wanted a son. He eventually divorced her and married his mistress. The scandal outraged the church. Political factions stirred. Irene eventually deposed her own son and ruled as empress in her own right. Family dinners in Byzantium must have been tense. Even in more peaceful marriages, pressure loomed. Queens were expected to conceive quickly. Fertility was political currency. Failure was blamed disproportionately on women. Superstitions flourished. Relics were consulted. Pilgrimarchies undertook, all in hope that biology might cooperate with diplomacy. And when children did arrive, the cycle repeated. Another arranged match. Another alliance. Another carefully choreographed ceremony leading to a very symbolic bed. Sometimes affection developed slowly over time. Sometimes it never did. Sometimes it was replaced by mutual respect, or polite indifference, or silent resentment. But rarely did it resemble the romantic ideals we attach to marriage today. It is oddly calming to consider how structured it all was. Emotion compressed into protocol. Private lives shaped by treaties. Wedding nights observed by witnesses in some courts just to confirm consummation. Because nothing says romance like official documentation. And yet, within these constrained circumstances, individuals still felt deeply. Catherine of Aragon maintained her dignity. Marie Antoinette sought pleasure in fashion and friendship. Maria of Amnia endured exile quietly. These were not cardboard figures. They were human beings navigating impossible expectations under shadow. We are talking about royal children, the tiny humans upon whom entire dynasties balanced. No pressure. Of course, a royal baby was not simply a baby. It was an event. Cannons fired. Church bells rang. Courtiers bowed to a swaddled infant who could not yet hold up its own head, because that child was the future. The heir, the political insurance policy, and if it was a boy, the relief was almost audible across the kingdom. But survival was never guaranteed. Medieval and early modern infant mortality was high. Even in palaces, even with physicians hovering nearby, holding herbs in confidence, so every cough was alarming. Every fever suspicious. Queens endured repeated pregnancies because statistically, not all children would survive. It was less sentimental than we might imagine. It was mathematics with lace trimming. Let's drift to the Tudor nursery. Henry VIII's children grew up under intense scrutiny. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward each experienced childhood shaped by their father's shifting affections. Edward VI, the long-awaited male heir, was physically delicate, pale, serious, educated intensely from a young age because he was king-in-waiting almost from birth. He became king at 9 years old. 9. While most children are learning handwriting, Edward was navigating Protestant reforms and council politics. His tutors filled his days with Latin, theology, governance. Play existed, but lightly. Responsibility weighed heavily, and his health remained fragile. He died at 15, a boy wrapped in royal expectation from cradle to grave. Now let's float to France. Louis XIII, father of Louis XIV, had his own peculiar childhood. He was shy, withdrawn, intensely supervised by his mother, Marie de Medici. Royal children were rarely raised by their parents directly. Instead, they were assigned governesses, tutors. Their schedules were strict. Their movements observed. Louis XIII struggled socially. He preferred solitude, music, hunting later in life. His early years were marked by isolation and emotional distance. And when he became king, that guarded temperament followed him. Royal childhood shapes royal adulthood. Quietly, persistently. Let's drift again to Spain. Poor Charles II, whom we mentioned earlier, the last Habsburg king of Spain, his childhood was dominated by illness. He could not walk until later than usual. He struggled with speech. His physical development was slow. Physicians experimented with treatments that were creative, none particularly effective. He was protected intensely, watched constantly, and yet no amount of care could fully compensate for generations of close-kin marriages. Charles grew up aware, perhaps dimly, that he was different. That expectations surrounded him, that whispers followed him. It is a heavy thing to be a symbol of dynastic decline before reaching adulthood. Now let's glide to Russia. Ivan VI became emperor as an infantile actual baby, crowned before he could form memories. Political factions maneuvered around his cradle, and soon he was overthrown. Spent most of his life imprisoned. A child born into unimaginable status, then erased quietly from public life. His childhood was not playful. It was confined. Shadowed. Royal nurseries were also spaces of competition. If multiple sons existed, hierarchy formed early. The eldest was heir. The spare was insurance. Younger siblings understood their roles quickly. Some accepted it, others quietly resented it. In England, the relationship between Prince Arthur and his younger brother Henry must have been layered. Arthur was heir, carefully groomed. Henry, initially the spare, received a church-oriented education. Then Arthur died unexpectedly, and suddenly Henry became heir. Destiny reshuffled like cards. Childhood roles reversed overnight. Education for royal children was intense. Languages, history, theology, warfare, court etiquette. From early years, they were reminded of who they were, or, more accurately, what they represented. Individual personality often took second place to institutional function. Even leisure was strategic. Public appearances began young children. Children were displayed to reassure the population. A healthy heir meant stability. So the nursery, though physically separate, was politically central. Let's float gently to the Ottoman court. Princes were raised within the palace complex, but often separated from public life. As they matured, they were sent to govern provinces, gaining experience. But earlier centuries carried darker customs, where succession struggles led to brothers being eliminated to prevent civil war. It was not chaotic violence nightly. It was structured, institutionalized precaution, cold, bureaucratic, and terrifying for any royal child aware of the stakes. Yet, despite these pressures, children remained children. They played with pets. They laughed at small jokes. They clung to favorite attendants. Letters from some royal parents reveal genuine affection. Not every nursery was loveless, but affection coexisted with expectation. Marie Antoinette adored her children. Catherine the Great worried over her son Paul. Even as their relationship grew strained, Queen Victoria, later in history, filled nurseries across Europe with her many offspring. Love existed, but it was always threaded with duty. Imagine falling asleep each night, knowing your future was predetermined, that your marriage would be arranged, your alliances calculated, your personal desires secondary. It creates a peculiar kind of maturity, or sometimes rebellion. Louis XIV's own childhood during the Fronde series of civil uprisings left him deeply distrustful of Parisian nobility. He was forced to flee the city as a boy. The instability marked him. As king, he centralized power at Versailles. Control became comfort. A child's insecurity shaped a monarch's governance. So when we picture silk cradles and golden rattles, remember the invisible weight stitched into those blankets. Survival was uncertain. Expectations enormous. Privacy non-existent. All right. Let's stay with them as they grow up. The silk blankets are folded away. The tutors step back. The crown, once a distant glittering object in the corner of the nursery, is now heavy and very real, because childhood in a palace does not simply end. It settles into habits, into anxieties, into peculiar adult routines that make historians raise a slow eyebrow centuries later. Take Louis XIV. Again, the Sun King. Radiant, controlled, obsessed with ceremony. That obsession did not appear magically at age 30. It grew from a childhood disrupted by rebellion. The Fronde forced him to flee Paris. Nobles challenged authority. Stability cracked. So when he became king, he designed Versailles like a beautifully gilded cage. He required nobles to attend his daily routines. Even the act of getting dressed became a public ritual, because control soothed him. Structure felt safe, and if everyone was watching him wake up in the morning, they were not plotting in the shadows. Probably now drift to England. Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, declared illegitimate after her mother's execution, restored to favor later. Her childhood was a lesson in unpredictability. Affection could vanish. Status could flip overnight. So as Queen, Elizabeth guarded her independence fiercely. She never married. Not because she lacked suitors. Europe practically lined up. But marriage meant vulnerability, shared authority, possible loss of control. She had learned early that dependence was dangerous, so she remained the Virgin Queen. Married to her kingdom, as she carefully branded it. Emotional self-preservation wrapped in political strategy. Let's float toward Spain again. Philip II, son of Charles V, raised within immense expectations of Catholic leadership and imperial duty. He became methodical, reserved, deeply serious. He preferred paperwork to pageantry. While other monarchs dazzled ballrooms, Philip sat at desks, reviewing documents late into the night. Governance as routine. Rotinas reassurans. He had been trained from youth to carry an empire, so he carried it quietly, persistently, sometimes rigidly. Now slide gently into Russia. Peter the Great. His childhood was chaotic. Power struggles, violence in Moscow, fear. He witnessed unrest at a formative age, and as Tsar, he reacted by reshaping Russia with relentless energy. Westernizing reforms, military restructuring, beard taxes, because apparently even facial hair required regulation. Peter's intensity can be traced back to early instability. When your childhood feels fragile, adulthood sometimes becomes a personal renovation project. And then there's Charles I of England. Quiet, formal, slightly aloof. He grew up under the towering personality of James I, always slightly in the shadow, always measured against expectations. As king, Charles clung tightly to the idea of divine right, authority granted by God, non-negotiable. His rigidity did not bend easily to parliamentary pressure, and while we won't dive into dramatic detail, we can say gently that inflexibility rarely ends peacefully in politics. Let's soften the lighting again, and consider Marie Antoinette, as an adult queen. Her teenage awkwardness matured into a desire for privacy. She built the petty, escaped court ritual when she could, played at pastoral simplicity. Critics saw extravagance. She likely saw relief, a space where she was not constantly evaluated. Childhood scrutiny does not evaporate. It lingers. It shapes where you seek comfort. Even quieter figures show the pattern. George III of Britain, diligent and domestically inclined, grew up under structured education and moral seriousness. He valued routine, family life, agricultural interests. When mental health struggles later emerged, they unfolded against a backdrop of enormous responsibility. Being raised to embody national stability leaves little room for visible vulnerability. Royal adulthood often looked polished. Portraits so compose her authority, confidence. But beneath that oil paint were habits formed in nurseries, craving for control, distrust of intimacy, or sometimes desperate longing for it. Let's drift one final time to the Habsburgs. Generations raised within the same tightly woven family structure. Emphasis on lineage purity, tradition, continuity. Change was suspicious. Outsiders were strategic tools. The emotional range available to many of these rulers was narrow. Duty first. Feeling second, if at all. And yet, occasionally, tenderness survived. Letters between spouses reveal affection. Diaries show insecurity. Marginal notes in prayer books hint at doubt. These were not mythic beings. They were people raised inside institutions that rarely allowed them to simply be people. So what happens after the crown settles permanently? Life becomes repetition. Councils, ceremonies, carefully managed appearances, private conversations in dim chambers. Habits harden, eccentricities grow. The child who is watched constantly may seek solitude. The child who felt powerless may cling to ritual. The child who feared instability may redesign an entire capital city just to feel secure. It's strangely human, isn't it? Remove the gold embroidery, and the pattern feels familiar. Early experiences shape adult coping. Only here, the coping mechanisms influence nations. And as we gently close the palace doors for tonight, notice how quiet everything becomes. The nursery echoes fade. The wedding feasts are distant memories. The mistresses retire to their apartments. The kings sit at desks under candlelight. The queens stare thoughtfully into fireplaces that never quite warm the whole room. Power glitters, but it rarely comforts.
Now we begin with something cold. Not emotionally cold. Not politically cold. Just physically cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you question every life decision that led you to a stone castle in northern Europe in the year 1327. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull a blanket a little tighter around you, and let's drift back to a time when royal luxury meant being only slightly less miserable than everyone else. Because contrary to the fantasy films, medieval queens were not gliding around in perfectly heated marble corridors. They were shivering, elegantly, but still shivering. Now, when we imagine a queen, we picture velvet gowns, golden crowns, maybe a dramatic balcony moment. What we do not picture is her breath fogging in the air indoors. But castles, especially the grand stone ones, were essentially decorative refrigerators with banners. Thick stone walls were wonderful for defense, not so wonderful for retaining heat. Fireplaces existed, yes, but they warmed only the immediate area in front of them. If Her Majesty dared to take 3 dramatic steps away from the hearth, congratulations. She had re-entered medieval winter mode. The cold was constant, damp, sneaky, and it did not care about royal titles. So how did a medieval queen actually sleep in that environment? The answer is layers. So many layers. First, the bed itself was an event. We are not talking about a simple wooden frame. Royal beds were massive wooden structures with heavy drapes and canopies. And this was not just for aesthetic drama. The canopy bed was a survival strategy. Thick curtains enclosed the bed on all sides, trapping heat from braziers or nearby fireplaces. Essentially, queens built themselves little fabric fortresses inside their already large stone fortress. A castle within a castle, cozy by medieval standards. Underneath her, the mattress was usually stuffed with straw, feathers, or wool. The more powerful the queen, the more likely she was to get feathers instead of what was basically hay in a sack. Feathers provided insulation and softness, which was important when your day involved political intrigue and possibly negotiating with your husband's unpredictable relatives. Sheets were made of linen, and over that came heavy wool blankets, sometimes fur-lined covers. Animal fur was not just a fashion statement, it was insulation. If you were royalty, you might be sleeping under ermine or sable. Very glamorous, also very necessary. Let's gently picture the queen preparing for bed. She would not be slipping into silk lingerie like a Renaissance painting suggests. Instead, she wore a long linen shift, sometimes two, woolen night garments if it was especially brutal outside. And yes, she likely kept a head covering on while sleeping, because heat escapes from the head. Medieval people understood this intuitively, even if they could not calculate thermal loss. So imagine a queen in a linen shift, woolen gown, cap on her head, climbing into a four-poster bed that looks majestic, but functions like an insulated tent. Romance level, moderate. Practicality level, high. Now, let's talk about preheating. Because yes, medieval queens had their version of turning on the heater before bed. Servants would place heated stones or metal warming pans filled with hot coals between the sheets before she entered. The warming pan was essentially a long-handled metal container. It would be slid under the covers to gently warm the bed. And by gently, we mean hopefully not set it on fire. It required skill. Too little heat, and you still froze. Too much, and you had a rather inconvenient royal emergency. Of course, no one wanted to be the servant who accidentally flambéed the monarchy. Privacy, interestingly, was limited. Even as a queen, you rarely slept entirely alone in the room. Ladies-in-waiting often shared the chamber, not necessarily the bed, but the space. Royal bedrooms were semi-public areas. Important discussions could happen there. Politics did not clock out at bedtime. So while the queen was tucked inside her curtained cocoon, attendants might be nearby on pallets or smaller beds. It was cozy, in a mildly crowded way. Think less solitary sanctuary and more elite sleepover with geopolitical consequences. And we should gently address the emotional temperature as well. Many medieval queens were married for alliance, not affection. So the man climbing into that carefully pre-warmed bed might be a stranger from another country, possibly significantly older, possibly already entangled in complicated court drama. So warmth was not always emotional. Sometimes the thick wool blankets did more heavy lifting than the marriage itself. Of course, he was chosen for strategic advantage. Love was optional. Thermal survival was not. Hygiene before bed was minimal by modern standards, but not non-existent. Contrary to myth, medieval people did bathe, just not daily. Queens had access to heated water when available, but during harsh winters, a full bath was an event. Instead, washing hands and face was common. Perfumed cloths, herbs, and dried flowers were sometimes placed in bedding to make things smell less like a medieval fortress and more like lavender optimism. Because stone walls tend to trap scents, and not always the poetic kind, seasonal changes mattered immensely. In summer, those same thick curtains that trapped heat became suffocating. But in winter, they were life-saving. Some castles had inner chambers, smaller and easier to heat, reserved for colder months. Royal apartments were often located on upper floors to avoid ground-level dampness, though that meant more exposure to wind. It was a constant balancing act. Architects were experimenting in real time with the concept of maybe less draft would be nice. And so, night would settle over the castle. Torches dimmed, fires reduced to embers. The queen enclosed in her heavy wooden bed, wrapped in linen and wool and fur, inside a chamber of stone that groaned softly in the wind. Outside, frost formed along arrow slits. Inside, breath slowly warmed the air within the curtains. It was not central heating. It was not memory foam. But it was survival with style. A small pocket of warmth carved out of a very cold world. As she drifted to sleep, politics paused. Alliances waited until morning. The cold pressed against the castle walls, but within that curtained space, there was a fragile comfort. And honestly, if you squint just a little, it almost sounds cozy. Almost. Now that we are properly bundled up, let's gently wander deeper into the stone corridors and meet some of the queens who endured this nightly ritual. Because sleeping in the cold was only one of their problems, and medieval royalty, as we know, never did anything halfway, not even discomfort. Let's float over to an actual queen, because it is one thing to discuss installation strategies. It is another to imagine a real woman wrapped in wool and political anxiety, trying to rest while Europe rearranges itself around her. Let's begin with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Of course we will. When in doubt, choose the queen with the most dramatic resume. Eleanor was Queen of France, then Queen of England, because apparently one crown was not enough. She lived in the 12th century, when castles were especially drafty and husbands were especially inconvenient. As Queen of France, she would have slept in the royal residences along the Seine, where winter air from the river drifted into stone halls with absolutely no respect for her royal status. Even as a young queen, her nights were likely spent inside heavy bed hangings, layered in furs, listening to the muffled coughs of servants nearby. And Eleanor did not have the luxury of peaceful domestic bliss. Her first husband, Louis VII of France, was pious, serious, and about as emotionally warm as the castle walls in January. Their marriage was more theological debate than romantic partnership. So picture Eleanor, intelligent and restless, lying awake in a curtained bed, contemplating both the Crusades and her husband's personality. The bed might have been warm from heated stones, but the atmosphere slightly frosty. Eventually she divorced Louis, which in the 12th century was basically a bold announcement to all of Europe that she had opinions. Then she married Henry II of England, because why not double down? Henry was brilliant, energetic, and not exactly calm. His temper alone could probably have heated a small chamber, but their marriage became famously strained. Political disagreements, rebellious sons, imprisonment. Yes, Eleanor actually spent years confined by her own husband. So if we imagine her later nights in English castles, the cold stone walls become almost symbolic. She slept in luxury, technically, but also under watch. Royal comfort has layers. So does royal resentment. Now let's drift gently forward to Isabella of France, sometimes called the she-wolf of France, which sounds dramatic. But remember, we are keeping things mellow. Isabella married Edward II of England. Edward preferred the company of his male favorites. Isabella preferred stability. What she got was a marriage that felt like sleeping in a bed that someone else kept rearranging. English castles in the early 14th century were not warmer than their French counterparts. In fact, they were often worse. Damp air from the surrounding countryside seeped into everything. Isabella would have had thick wool tapestries hung along the stone walls of her chamber. Tapestries were not just art, they were insulation. Without them, walls radiated cold like oversized ice blocks. At night, she likely relied on braziers placed carefully in the room, along with layers of fur-lined covers. But emotional warmth? Limited supply. Edward's favoritism toward his companions created tension so thick it might have felt heavier than the bed curtains themselves. Eventually, Isabella led a rebellion against him, which is one way to deal with marital dissatisfaction. Let's gently move to Scotland for a moment. Margaret of Norway, the so-called Maid of Norway, was technically Queen of Scots at the age of 3. 3, which is an age when most children are negotiating bedtime snacks, not succession crises. She never even made it to Scotland, dying en route. But imagine for a moment the royal children raised in those northern castles. Cold was not an occasional inconvenience. It was the background setting of life. Royal nurseries were placed in inner chambers when possible, smaller rooms easier to heat. Cradles were lined with wool. Nurses slept nearby to ensure infants did not succumb to the chill. Even queens giving birth had to contend with winter air creeping through arrow slits. And childbirth, by the way, required warmth. Rooms were sealed as tightly as possible. Fires burned continuously. Windows were covered. Heavy drapes enclosed the birthing bed much like the sleeping bed, creating a womb within stone walls. Queens were expected to produce heirs, preferably male, preferably healthy, preferably without personally dying in the process. So warmth was more than comfort. It was survival strategy. Now let's wander south to Spain and meet Joanna of Castile. Poor Joanna, known to history as Joanna the Mad, which feels slightly unfair. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, married to Philip the Handsome. He was called the Handsome, which sounds promising, but personality reviews were mixed. Joanna loved him intensely. Philip did not necessarily return that intensity. After his early death, Joanna's grief was profound. There are stories of her traveling with his coffin slowly for months. Spanish castles, particularly in Castile, were slightly warmer than northern fortresses. But do not picture sunshine and comfort. Stone is stone. Winter nights were still cold. Joanna spent long periods confined, first politically isolated, then declared unstable. Imagine her in those dim chambers, heavy curtains drawn, braziers glowing softly, the air thick with incense and whispers. Royal beds cannot cure loneliness, even with fur blankets piled high. And speaking of isolation, let's quietly step into the world of Cleves. Yes, the fourth wife of Henry VIII, and arrived in England from the Duchy of Cleves, expecting a marriage alliance. Henry took one look at her and decided he had been misled by a flattering portrait, which, honestly, is medieval catfishing at its finest. Their marriage was annulled within months, but Anne adapted remarkably well. She was granted properties and lived comfortably in England afterward. In her residences, she would have enjoyed improved Tudor heating methods. By the 16th century, fireplaces were larger, chimneys more advanced, still draughty, though always draughty. She slept in grand chambers with elaborate testers and embroidered hangings. And unlike some queens, she slept without the constant anxiety of producing an heir for Henry, which may have been the coziest outcome available in that situation. Let's not forget Catherine de' Medici in France. Italian-born, transplanted to the French court, navigating religious wars and court rivalries. The Louvre in her time was less glass pyramid and more fortified palace. Cold corridors, heavy doors. Catherine was known for her elaborate court rituals. Her bedchamber was a stage for politics. Access to the Queen at bedtime could be a calculated privilege. Even sleep became ceremonial. Her bed would have been enormous, elevated on a platform, surrounded by embroidered draperies. Ladies in waiting stationed strategically. The Queen might retire behind curtains, but courtiers remained aware of every movement. Privacy was selective. Warmth was curated. The physical environment reflected her authority. Yet outside those curtains, France simmered with tension. Religion divided the kingdom, and Catherine lay awake some nights, knowing that no amount of tapestry could insulate against civil unrest. As we drift through these lives, notice a pattern. The bed was not just furniture. It was a political chamber, a medical ward, a nursery, a negotiation table, a prison cell. Queens slept inside structures designed to protect dynasties, not necessarily their comfort. The cold was constant, yes, but so was expectation. Produce heirs, secure alliances, maintain dignity, do not complain about the temperature, and yet they adapted. They layered wool upon linen. They invested in thicker tapestries. They redesigned chambers. Over centuries, castles evolved. Windows gained shutters. Fireplaces improved. By the late medieval period, some royal residences were genuinely warmer. Progress slow. Drafty progress. So as night settles again over our imaginary stone fortress, picture one of these queens enclosed in her bed, fur-lined covers drawn high, a warming pan recently removed, the air inside the curtains gently heated by her own breath. Outside, the wind presses against towers built for war. Inside, she finally closes her eyes. Sleep, for a medieval queen, was never entirely peaceful, but it was persistent, like history itself.
Now let's gently glide away from the individuals and look at the buildings themselves, because at some point, someone must have thought, perhaps we could try less draft, Revolutionary idea? Truly bold for the Middle Ages. Early medieval castles were not designed for comfort, they were designed to survive being attacked by neighbors who also lived in cold stone boxers. Thick walls, narrow windows, high ceilings, all excellent for defense, all terrible for heat retention. The Great Hall, where most daily life happened, had a central hearth in earlier centuries. That means the fire sat in the middle of the room, and smoke drifted upward toward a hole in the roof. Romantic? Maybe. Efficient? Not particularly. Warm air escaped. Cold air entered. Everyone pretended this was fine. Queens in these early castles often slept in chambers branching off the Great Hall. Privacy was limited. Noise carried, and warmth inconsistent. If the fire died down at night, so did your comfort. Servants might keep embers alive, but fuel was precious. Wood had to be gathered, transported, chopped. Heating an entire castle was not as simple as turning a dial, so most spaces were simply cold by default. Gradually, architecture began to evolve. Chimneys were introduced more widely between the 12th and 14th centuries, and this was a quiet revolution. With chimneys, fireplaces could be built against walls. Smoke could be directed upward and out. Rooms could be smaller and more enclosed. Suddenly, heat could linger instead of immediately floating off into the night sky. It was not central heating. Let's not get carried away, but it was progress. Royal chambers became more specialized. Instead of one massive communal hall, castles developed private apartments. A queen might have a withdrawing room, a bedchamber, even a small closet-like space for prayer. Smaller rooms were easier to warm. Fires could be maintained in individual fireplaces, and heavy wooden doors helped block drafts. You can almost feel medieval architects slowly discovering the concept of insulation. Betty is slowly, like a cat cautiously approaching a new idea. Tapestries deserve another moment of appreciation. These were not just decorative Instagram backdrops for royal life. They were thick, woven masterpieces hung along stone walls specifically to trap heat. Behind them, cold air still pressed against the stone. But inside the room, warmth lingered a little longer. The wealthier the monarch, the thicker and more numerous the tapestries. So yes, luxury was measurable in degrees of thermal comfort. Floors were another issue. Stone floors radiate cold with enthusiasm, so rushes, straw, and woven rugs were spread across them. Over time, more elaborate carpets appeared in wealthier courts. These did not eliminate the chill, but they softened it. Imagine stepping out of bed onto woven wool instead of icy stone. That alone might improve your opinion of monarchy. Windows were perhaps the greatest culprit in the war against warmth. Early castle windows were narrow, slits, defensive, dramatic, freezing. Glass, when available, was expensive and small-paned. Shutters were essential. At night, they were closed tightly. Heavy curtains layered over them. Some queens even had padded window coverings installed in their private chambers, a medieval version of blackout curtains, but primarily for thermal survival. Let's drift into the Tudor period for a moment. By the time we reached the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, castles were gradually morphing into palaces. Defense still mattered, but comfort began to matter more. Henry VIII, for example, loved a good palace. Hampton Court was far more refined than earlier fortresses. Multiple fireplaces, enclosed courtyards, better glazing and windows. It was still cold in winter, but less aggressively so. Of course, heating technology was still limited to fire, and fire has moods. Too little, you shiver. Too much, you suffocate. Smoke sometimes lingered even with chimneys, soot-coated ceilings. Servants constantly adjusted logs and embers. Royal comfort required continuous labor. A queen's warm chamber was the product of many unseen hands. Now imagine night settling in a slightly more advanced 15th century palace. The queen retires from the Great Hall, where torches flicker along paneled walls. She moves into her private chamber. A fire already burns low in the hearth. Tapestries line the walls. The bed stands elevated, its canopy thick with embroidered fabric. Servants bring a warming pan, Sliding it between linen sheets, curtains are drawn around the bed, creating that familiar insulated cube. But here is something interesting. As architecture improved, so did expectations. Once queens experienced slightly warmer rooms, they noticed discomfort more sharply. A draft became an annoyance rather than an inevitability. Letters from later medieval and early modern courts occasionally mention complaints about cold chambers, which is almost charming. Imagine ruling over kingdoms yet still annoyed by a chilly corridor. Furniture also played a role. Beds grew grander, taller, more enclosed. The four-poster evolved into heavily draped structures with testers help strap rising warm air. Some beds were so large they required steps to climb into height. Warm air rises, after all. Medieval physics by observation, not by equation. Another subtle shift came with clothing. Nightwear became more specialized. Earlier centuries relied heavily on simple linen shifts. Later periods saw quilted garments, padded robes, and layered textiles specifically designed for warmth indoors. Royal wardrobes expanded, and since monarchs loved displaying wealth, they embraced fabric abundance. If you cannot install radiators, at least wear velvet. Let's not forget that queens were often moved between residences depending on season. Royal courts were itinerant for centuries. Tetrabalid, partly political, partly practical. Some castles were more bearable in winter, others better suited for summer. So the medieval solution to uncomfortable architecture was sometimes simply relocation, which must have been exhausting. Imagine packing up an entire court because the walls were too drafty. Despite all improvements, though, the stone remained. Even in later centuries, castles and palaces could never fully escape their materials. Cold seeped in during harsh winters. Ice sometimes formed inside window frames. Fires had to burn constantly. Servants rose before dawn to rekindle embers so that the royal household did not awaken to Arctic conditions. And yet, something about the ritual persisted. The heavy curtains, the layered blankets, the warming pan, the muffled crackle of firelight against stone. Over time, it became tradition as much as necessity. Royal bedtime was ceremony. The queen retiring behind drapes symbolized the end of courtly business. The physical act of enclosing herself in fabric mirrored the symbolic withdrawal from public life. Soare, were, castles evolving. Chimneys rising, tapestries thickening, floors softening. Slowly, stubbornly, the medieval world inching toward comfort. Not comfort as we know it, let's not exaggerate, but comfort enough that a queen might close her eyes without immediately calculating wind direction. And as we let the embers glow low and the chamber settle into quiet warmth, we can almost appreciate the strange resilience of these women. Surrounded by stone, wrapped in fur, balancing dynasties by day and drafts by night, the queen has withdrawn to her chamber, that semi-public stage, where bedtime is less a collapse and more a ceremony. Because, of course, it is. Nothing in medieval royalty was ever just casual, not even sleep. Evening began long before the queen actually lay down. Supper was served earlier than modern dinner hours, often in the great hall, or a more intimate private dining chamber. Heavy foods were common. Bread, meats, stews thick enough to count as insulation. Wine or ale flowed gently. No sparkling water with lemon slices here. After the meal, there might be music. Lutes played softly. Harps strummed in slow patterns. Conversation drifted from alliances to whether someone's cousin was behaving suspiciously again. Court life had a way of following you everywhere. When it was finally time to retire, the queen did not simply wander off alone. Attendants accompanied her. Ladies in waiting carried candles, their flames bending slightly in the drafts that still lingered despite architectural improvements. The queen would enter her chamber, often already warmed by servants who had been tending the fire for hours. The bed curtains might already be partially drawn, like a stage waiting for its final act. Now, let's slow this down. The queen removes her outer gown. Layers come off carefully. Velvet, brocade, silk. Beneath it, linen. Always linen. Clean linen was prized. It could be laundered more frequently than heavy gowns. Personal hygiene in the medieval court was more attentive than popular myth suggests. Hands were washed, faces wiped with damp cloths. Sometimes scented water was used. Lavender, rosemary. A quiet attempt to make the stone room feel less like stone. Hair, too, was managed before sleep. Long hair was often braided loosely to prevent tangling. A linen cap or coif covered the head. Not glamorous, perhaps, but practical. Heat retention mattered. And so did neatness. Even in Slee, appearance carried weight. One never knew who might enter the chamber in the morning. Prayers were common. Medieval queens were deeply immersed in religious life. Before bed, she might kneel beside her bed, attendants stepping respectfully back. Candles flicker. Shadows move along tapestry scenes of saints and battles. The queen whispers prayers for her children, for her husband, for the stability of her kingdom. Possibly for warmer weather. We can imagine that request slipping in quietly. After prayers, attendants prepare the bed itself. The warming pan has done its job. The sheets are smooth, the blankets layered in precise order. Fur on top. Linen closest to the skin. The queen climbs the small steps to the elevated mattress. Yes, many royal beds were high enough to require steps. Height meant prestige. It also meant being slightly closer to rising warm air. Practical vanity at its finest. Once inside, the curtains are drawn fully. This is important. The curtains create an enclosed air pocket. Warmth from the body accumulates. Breathing slowly warms the tiny enclosed space. Outside the curtains, the chamber might still be cool. Inside, it becomes tolerable. Almost snug. The effect is immediate and surprisingly effective. Medieval engineering through fabric. But the queen is not necessarily alone. A trusted lady might sleep nearby, perhaps even in a smaller truckle bed. Privacy in the modern sense did not quite exist. Royal bodies were political entities. Witnesses mattered. Even childbirth required observers. So sleep, too, unfolded within quiet company. The rustle of fabric, the soft settling of straw mattresses, the crackle of dying firewood. Sometimes conversation continued in hushed tones. A whispered concern about a foreign ambassador, a quiet joke about a pompous noble. Yes, humor existed, even in cold stone castles. Especially there, when discomfort is constant, light sarcasm becomes survival. One can almost hear a lady-in-waiting murmur. At least the wind is polite tonight. As the shutters rattle, and then there were disturbances. Medieval nights were not silent. Wind whistled through arrow slits. Dogs barked in courtyards. Guards changed shifts, their footsteps echoing faintly along outer walls. Occasionally, the fire would sputter unexpectedly, requiring a servant to quietly mention that the embers needed tending. The queen might stir, but remain within her curtained sanctuary, wrapped tightly in wool and fur. Illness added another layer. Medieval winters were harsh. Coughs lingered. Fevers were common. Royal physicians might be summoned to the chamber. Herbal infusions brewed beside the hearth. Beds became sick rooms quickly. The same heavy curtains that trapped warmth also trapped the scent of medicinal herbs. Rosemary hung from beams. Lavender tucked into linens. It was healthcare as understood at the time, layered gently into nightly routine. Pregnancy altered the ritual further. Pregnant queens were monitored closely. Their chambers rear mention, additional tapestries, extra warmth. The birthing bed was prepared weeks in advance. Childbirth required sealing the room almost entirely. Windows shuttered, fires burning continuously. A warm, enclosed environment believed to protect both mother and child. The bed became a guarded sanctuary, a political cradle. But not every night was heavy with duty. Some nights were simply cold and ordinary. The queen, exhausted from courtly performance, might close her eyes quickly. The steady rhythm of her own breathing filling the curtained space. Outside, frost forming quietly on the outer walls. Inside, a fragile warmth maintained by fabric, fire, and persistence. Over centuries, small comforts accumulated. Feather mattresses improved sleep. Carpets softened footsteps. Window glass thickened, yet the ritual remained remarkably consistent. Wash, pray, warm the bed, draw the curtains, sleep inside a fabric chamber, within a stone chamber, within a fortified world. And perhaps that is what makes it strangely relatable. Strip away the crowns and alliances, and we find a human being trying to get comfortable before bed. Adjusting blankets, listening to the wind, hoping tomorrow's problems wait until morning. So, as the candles burn lower, and the castle settles into its creaking nighttime rhythm, we let our queen drift into sleep. Protected, if not perfectly warm, observed, if not entirely alone, wrapped in centuries of tradition and several layers of wool. Now, we must gently address the other presence in the bed, because medieval queens rarely slept alone for long. Royal marriage was not just companionship, it was policy. And policy, as we know, does not respect personal space. A shared royal bed was not primarily about romance. It was about heirs. Specifically, male ones. The bedchamber, warm and dimly lit, doubled as a dynastic workshop. The expectation hovered quietly in the air. Produce continuity. Secure alliances. Make the next generation. All while wrapped in wool and possibly listening to wind rattle the shutters. Nothing says intimacy like geopolitical responsibility. Now, we should note that not every royal couple despised one another. Some managed affection, but many marriages were arranged between strangers who met for the first time shortly before their wedding. Imagine climbing into an enclosed bed with someone you barely know, in a castle that smells faintly of smoke and lavender, under the watchful awareness of attendants nearby. It was not exactly the setting for spontaneous passion. It was more scheduled. In some cases, witnesses were even present for the bedding ceremony. Yes, actual observers, not in the bed itself, thankfully, but in the chamber. The idea was to confirm the marriage had been consummated, because medieval politics required proof. Privacy acknowledged the concept of modesty, but verification mattered more. After the ritualized departure of attendants, the curtains would close. The dynasty would begin its careful work. Let's drift gently to Philip II of Spain and his wives. Philip was methodical, deeply serious, intensely Catholic. His marriages were alliances first, relationships second. His fourth wife, Anna of Austria, was also his niece, because when you are a Habsburg, your family tree is more of a wreath. Anna was young, and the Spanish court was formal to the point of suffocation. Even in the royal bed, expectation loomed larger than affection, and yes, inbreeding quietly compounded over generations, leading to fragile heirs and delicate health. The bed carried more than blankets. It carried genetic consequences. Speaking of the Habsburgs, let's gently mention Charles II of Spain. He arrived later, in the 17th century, but his existence was the long echo of generations of strategic marriages within the same extended family. Charles suffered numerous health problems. His jaw was pronounced, his body fragile. He struggled to produce an heir despite 2 marriages. Imagine the pressure within those bed curtains. Physicians advising, courtiers speculating, a dynasty holding its breath, while the king tried to fulfill a biological duty complicated by centuries of limited gene pool enthusiasm. For queens, especially young brides sent to foreign courts, the shared bed could be intimidating. Catherine of Aragon arrived in England at 16. She first married Arthur, Prince of Wales. Their time together was brief and shrouded in quiet historical debate. After Arthur's death, she later married Henry VIII. For years, she endured the cycle of pregnancy and loss. The bed became a place of hope, followed by grief. Heated stones warmed the sheets, but no warming pan could prevent the heartbreak of repeated And then there was Henry VIII himself, a man whose marital history reads like an increasingly impatient search for a solution. And Boleyn entered that bed with ambition and sharp intelligence. The early years likely carried excitement, but once the pressure for a male heir intensified, the atmosphere shifted. The bed became less sanctuary and more scrutiny chamber. Anne's failure to produce a surviving son altered everything. The curtains that once offered privacy could not shield her from suspicion. Let's glide to France for a quieter example. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Their marriage began awkwardly. painfully, awkwardly. It took years for the marriage to be consummated. Years. Europe whispered. Pamphlets speculated the royal bed in Versailles was elaborate beyond reason. Gilded, elevated, surrounded by ritual. Even the act of going to bed could be public ceremony, known as the coucher. Nobles watched the king retire. Imagine trying to relax after that. Marie Antoinette was young, transplanted from Austria, navigating etiquette that bordered on theatrical absurdity. The bed was both intimate and staged. When children finally arrived, relief spread through the court. But until then, the shared bed symbolized delay. Expectation pressed against velvet curtains as persistently as winter wind. Not all queens were passive participants. Some wielded influence through intimacy. Political conversations often occurred in private chambers. Pillow talk could shift alliances. A quiet suggestion, whispered before sleep, might redirect policy. The bed, insulated though it was, remained a strategic space. Warmth fostered negotiation as much as affection. And then there were colder arrangements. Marriages where distance lingered, even under shared blankets. Edward II preferred the company of his favorites. Isabella of France found herself sidelined emotionally. The shared bed may have felt less like partnership and more like obligation. When emotional warmth disappears, even thick fur covers feel insufficient. Illness complicated everything further. Medieval medicine did not separate marital life from health anxieties. Concerns about fertility led to strange advice. Dietary adjustments, timed encounters based on astrological charts, prayers recited before and after. The bed became a place where science, superstition, and statecraft intertwined awkwardly. Over time, separate sleeping arrangements sometimes emerged among older royal couples. Practical reasons, health reasons, political reasons. By later centuries, it was not uncommon for monarchs to maintain adjoining but separate beds. This offered privacy and perhaps a bit of relief from relentless expectation. The symbolism remained intact, the practical logistics adapted. Through all of this, the physical environment remained constant. Heavy drapes, feather mattresses, wool blankets, crackling fire. The shed bed was both literal and metaphorical center of the monarchy. Dynasties rose or faltered there. Alliances were strengthened or strained beneath embroidered canopies. And yet, beneath the politics, two human beings still had to attempt sleep. After conversation faded, after expectation quieted, after servants withdrew, the steady rhythm of breathing filled the enclosed space. The warmth gradually built inside the curtains. Outside, the castle returned to its usual nighttime, sighing. Perhaps, in those rare, quiet moments, the cold receded entirely. And for a few hours, the bed was simply a bed, not a treaty table, not a genetic gamble, not a performance, just warmth carved from stone. Let's drift toward the smallest occupants of these stone fortresses, because once the curtains closed and the hoped-for air finally arrived, the question became immediate and practical. How do you keep a tiny human alive in what is essentially a decorative ice chamber? Royal infants were precious, not just emotionally, though that depended on the parent. They were politically priceless. The survival of a dynasty could rest on a cradle no bigger than a laundry basket, and medieval childhood, especially in winter, was delicate business. Castles were drafty for adults. For babies, they were potentially lethal, so nurseries were arranged with care. Royal children were rarely raised directly in the queen's sleeping chamber for long. Instead, dedicated rooms were selected, ideally interior chambers. Smaller spaces, easier to eat. Fires burned continuously in cold seasons. Windows were shuttered tightly. Heavy curtains covered every possible draught. Even then, maintaining warmth required constant effort. Servants rose through the night to tend embers, because a dying fire meant dropping temperatures, and dropping temperatures meant danger. Cradles themselves were layered with wool blankets and lined with soft materials. Swaddling was common practice. Infants were wrapped tightly in strips of cloth, which medieval people believed kept limbs straight and bodies warm. It also limited movement, which probably made caretakers' lives slightly easier. A swaddled royal baby resembled a small, carefully bundled scroll of parchment, valuable Parchment. Wet nurses were central figures in this quiet drama. Many queens did not nurse their own children, particularly in higher courts. A wet nurse would feed the infant, and often sleep in the same chamber. Her presence was constant. Imagine her rising gently in the dim light of a dying fire, lifting the swaddled air, whispering soft words while wind brushed the outer walls. Her warmth became part of the child's survival strategy. Royal childhood was paradoxical, surrounded by luxury, shadowed by fragility. Infant mortality rates in medieval Europe were high, even among nobility. Even with fires burning and furs layered thickly, illness crept through castles as quietly as cold air. Fevers, respiratory infections. The chill itself was not always the cause, but it rarely helped. Let's gently consider Edward VI of England. Born to Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, he was the long-awaited male heir. Celebrations echoed across the kingdom at his birth. Fires burned bright in royal chambers. His nursery was carefully prepared, warm and guarded. Yet Edward's health was delicate throughout his short life. He died at 15. Even royal blood and attentive heating could not guarantee longevity. And then there were the many children of Queen Anne of Great Britain in the late 17th century. She endured numerous pregnancies. Many children were stillborn or died young. The nursery must have been a place of hope and repeated grief. The fire lit again and again for newborns who did not stay long enough to grow accustomed to its warmth. In colder northern courts, like Scotland or Scandinavia, the challenge was amplified. Winters stretched longer. Snow pressed against castle walls for months. Royal children wore miniature versions of adult garments, layers of linen and wool, tiny caps tied beneath the chin to retain heat. Even indoors, the idea of a lightly dressed child running freely through heated hallways would have seemed like fantasy. Education began early, but gently. Tutors sometimes conducted lessons in warmed chambers. Smaller rooms were preferred during winter months. It is strangely comforting to imagine a young prince reciting Latin declensions beside a crackling fire, wrapped in a wool cloak too large for his narrow shoulders. The cold might nip at the edges of the room, but knowledge and expectation burned steadily at the center. Of course, the emotional climate of these nurseries mattered too. Some royal parents were affectionate, others were distant. Political necessity often overshadowed tenderness. Children might see their parents during scheduled visits rather than daily cuddles. The nursery staff became primary caregivers. Loyalty and attachment formed there. Within warmed rooms lined with tapestries depicting heroic ancestors who had also once been fragile infants. Let's not forget the Habsburg children again, because history insists. Generations of close-kin marriages resulted in high infant mortality and chronic illness. Small heirs, born into enormous expectation, their cradles carefully placed near the warmest wall. Physicians hovering with herbal remedies, prayers whispered continuously. The bed curtains that once enclosed a queen now enclosed hope in miniature form. As children grew older, sleeping arrangements shifted. Young princes and princesses might share rooms with siblings or attendants. Beds remained elevated, curtained, insulated, smaller than their parents, but structured similarly. The ritual continued. Warm the sheets. Close the shutters. Draw the drapes. The rhythm of medieval sleep passed quietly from generation to generation. Some royal children developed resilience from these conditions. They learned to endure discomfort without complaint. Others grew sickly, pale, frequently ill. Court physicians often blamed imbalances of humors. Rarely the architect. Stone walls were constants. Human bodies were variable. And yet, despite the cold and the pressure, childhood laughter existed. Games were played near wooden toys carved by craftsmen. Storytelling in winter evenings, a nurse recounting tales of saints and dragons, while snow collected outside arrow slits. Warmth was not only physical, it was relational. It came from proximity, from shared blankets, from whispered reassurances that morning would arrive. Night in the nursery followed familiar steps, fires lowered but never extinguished. Cradles checked, blankets tucked tightly. A nurse settling onto a pallet bed nearby. Outside, guards paced along frozen battlements. Inside, The fragile air breathed steadily beneath wool layers, and perhaps that is the quiet miracle, that in these vast, echoing fortresses built for war and dominance, small hearts continued to beat through long winters, protected by fabric, fire, and persistent human care. So, as the castle settles once more into stillness, we leave the nursery door slightly ajar, embers glowing softly, the cold presses against the stone, patient as ever. But inside, beneath layers of wool and dynasty, sleep holds its ground. Let's driven to a slightly stranger corner of the medieval night, because when the fires burned low and the corridors quieted, imagination had space to stretch, and medieval imagination did not do anything halfway, especially not at 2 in the morning. In a stone fortress that creaked like it had opinions, castles, by design, made noise. Wind moved through arrow slits with theatrical enthusiasm. Wooden beams expanded and contracted. Tapestries shifted slightly when drafts found their way behind them. To a tired queen lying inside her curtained bed, these sounds could feel interpretive. Medieval people were deeply religious, but they were also deeply superstitious. The line between theology and folklore was pleasantly blurry. Many queens slept with small religious objects nearby. A rosary under the pillow, a relic placed on a bedside table. Sometimes a tiny vial of holy water within reach. This was not decorative. It was protective. The night belonged to uncertainty. Demons were believed to wander more freely after sunset. Illness, too, was often interpreted through spiritual language. So the bed, already layered with wool and fur, was further layered with prayer. Let's imagine a queen in the 14th century, wrapped in linen and heavy blankets, her rosary beads cool in her hand. Outside, wind hums against the tower. She whispers a final prayer before sleep. Not dramatic, not fearful, just routine. A nightly negotiation with the unseen, because if you lived in a world without electric light, the dark felt thicker, more textured, almost present. Dreams carried weight as well. Medieval courts took dreams seriously. A vivid dream could be interpreted as a warning, a prophecy, or a divine nudge. Queens sometimes shared troubling dreams with confessors or trusted advisors. If a monarch dreamed of collapsing walls or lost crowns, interpretations followed swiftly. The bed was not only a physical space, it was a portal to meaning, or at least to elaborate speculation. And then there were more earthly fears. Assassination, for example. Royal bedchambers were guarded, yes, but paranoia had its place in history. Some monarchs insisted on specific sleeping arrangements to ensure safety. Guards stationed just outside the door. Trusted attendants within call. In certain periods, even food tasters remained close by. It is difficult to sleep deeply when your existence is politically inconvenient to someone else. Consider King James I of England and Vi of Scotland, deeply intelligent, slightly anxious, fascinated by witchcraft. He even wrote about it. In his era, fear of witches was not casual superstition. It was state-level concern. Imagine retiring to bed after a day of political tension and theological debate about demonic influence. The fire crackles. The shadows stretch. The imagination does the rest. Queens were not immune to such fears. Catherine de' Medici, navigating religious wars in France, reportedly consulted astrologers. Astrology was not fringe entertainment. It was woven into decisions. The alignment of stars might influence travel dates, marriages, even bedtime rituals. If an astrologer advised caution on a certain evening, perhaps the queen prayed longer before closing her eyes. Let's drift to England again. To Elizabeth I, the so-called Virgin Queen. Her nighttime habits were reportedly meticulous. She valued order, cleanliness, routine. Her bedchamber was carefully arranged. Servants followed strict protocols. Elizabeth was cautious by nature. She survived plots and political turbulence for decades. One can imagine her lying awake occasionally, mind turning over alliances and betrayals, listening to the distant shuffle of guards changing shifts. Of course, not every sound was sinister. Castles housed animals. Dogs often slept in chambers, providing warmth and companionship. The soft thump of a tail against a rug, the low sigh of a hound settling closer to the hearth. Comfort came in many forms. and perhaps a loyal dog eased fears more effectively than a relic. But illness remained the most persistent nighttime visitor. Without modern medicine, symptoms were mysterious. A fever that rose suddenly could feel ominous. Queens often kept herbal sachets near their beds, rosemary for memory and protection, lavender for calm, sage for purification. Whether scientifically effective or not, these rituals offered reassurance, and reassurance in a cold stone room mattered deeply. Even the layout of the bed carried symbolic weight. Some believed sleeping with the head toward a certain direction invited health. Others avoided mirrors in the bedchamber at night, fearing trapped spirits or bad dreams. Candles were extinguished carefully. A single flame left too long could spell disaster. A castle fire was no minor inconvenience. It was catastrophe, so the final act before sleep involved ensuring embers were safe, shutters secure, and curtains properly drawn. Let's not forget the emotional shadows. Guilt, regret, longing. Many queens were separated from their homeland, married into foreign courts. Night amplified homesickness. In the quiet behind bed curtains, memories surfaced. A childhood garden, a mother's voice, a language not spoken daily anymore. The stone walls did not echo those sounds back, and yet resilience persisted. Ritual became comfort. Familiar prayers, predictable routines, the same steps repeated nightly. Wash, braid hair, warm bed, whisper prayer, draw curtain. In a world that often felt unstable, bedtime offered structure. Even superstition offered a kind of order. Imagine the final moments before sleep. The fire reduced to a gentle glow. The chamber quiet, except for distant wind. The queen adjusts her blanket slightly higher. The rosary rests beside her hand. Beyond the curtains, the castle stands unmoving against the dark landscape. Within, one human heart slows its pace. Perhaps a dream forms. Not prophetic, not ominous. Husterdinari, a garden in spring. Sunlight instead of frost. Warmth without effort. Even medieval queens deserved that small mercy. And so the night continues. Steady and uneventful. The shadows remain shadows. The wind remains wind. And the queen, layered in fabric and faith, drifts softly into sleep. Now, slowly, almost reluctantly, history begins to soften. Because there came a time when royalty looked around at their massive stone fortresses and quietly thought, what if we did not have to suffer quite this much? It did not happen overnight. Medieval architecture does not wake up one morning and decide to be cozy. But as warfare changed, as cannons made high stone walls less invincible, and as monarchs grew more interested in displaying wealth than deflecting arrows, castles began a gentle transformation. Defense slowly gave way to comfort. Towers shrank, windows widened, and somewhere, a draft lost its authority. The Renaissance played its part. Italian palaces offered a different model. They were still grand, still intimidating in their own refined way. But they favored proportion and light over fortress severity. Royal courts across Europe began to borrow these ideas. Larger windows meant more sunlight. More sunlight meant slightly warmer days. And perhaps a queen could sit near a window without feeling like she was posing inside a wind tunnel. Let's drift to France again. The Louvre, originally a medieval fortress, evolved over centuries into a palace. Later monarchs expanded it, not to repel invaders, but to impress guests. Interior spaces became more elaborate, walls paneled with wood rather than bare stone. Wood, importantly, does not radiate cold with quite the same enthusiasm. A subtle but meaningful improvement. Fireplaces grew larger and more decorative. Chimneys were refined. Rooms were designed around heat distribution. Instead of a single vast hall swallowing warmth, palaces developed clusters of rooms that retained heat more efficiently. Corridors replaced open galleries. Doors closed more tightly. Windows, though still imperfect, were glazed more thoroughly. And then came Versailles. Ah, yes, the ultimate statement that perhaps living in a drafty medieval box was no longer necessary. Louis XIV decided he would build something expansive, theatrical, and thoroughly heated by comparison. Versailles was not exactly a tropical paradise in winter, but it represented a philosophical shift. Comfort and spectacle merged. Now, we should not exaggerate. Even Versailles could be cold. Long corridors and vast rooms still challenged fireplaces. Courtiers reportedly huddled in cloaks during harsh winters, but compared to a 12th century stone keep, it was practically indulgent. Marble fireplaces lined grand apartments, multiple hearths burned simultaneously. The royal bedchamber itself became a ceremonial stage, but also more insulated than its medieval ancestors. Let's imagine the difference from a queen's perspective. Instead of narrow arrow slits, she has tall windows. Instead of raw stone, she sees carved paneling and fabric-covered walls. Instead of relying entirely on heavy curtains for survival, she enjoys rooms designed with heating in mind. The bed remains elaborate, still elevated, still draped. But now it sits within a chamber built for elegance rather than endurance. England followed a similar path. Medieval castles like the Tower of London gradually lost their residential dominance. Tudor palaces such as Hampton Court and later Whitehall emphasized comfort. By the Stuart period, architecture embraced symmetry, proportion, and improved heating systems. Fireplaces became architectural centerpieces. Rooms were arranged in enfilades, allowing controlled airflow rather than chaotic drafts. And then, in the 18th century, innovation quietly accelerated. Coal acknowledged its potential. Great improved efficiency. Some early experiments with ducted heating appeared in large estates. Nothing modern yet, but noticeable progress. A queen in the Georgian era experienced winters very differently from Eleanor of Aquitaine. Furniture also evolved. Upholstered chairs replaced rigid benches. Carpets became more common, imported from the East, or woven domestically in increasingly intricate patterns. Floors softened. Walls insulated. The atmosphere changed from echoing austerity to controlled opulence. Let's not forget technology's steady march forward. By the 19th century, central heating systems began appearing in grand residences. Steam heating, radiators. The concept of evenly distributed warmth became reality, and suddenly, centuries of carefully managed bed curtains felt almost archaic. Imagine Queen Victoria sleeping in Buckingham Palace with emerging modern heating systems. No need for heated stones, no desperate reliance on fur-lined covers. The bed remained grand, of course, but the room itself maintained a baseline warmth. For the first time in royal history, winter nights indoors did not automatically mean strategic layering. And yet, tradition lingered. Four-poster beds persisted long after their insulating necessity faded. Curtains remained part of royal aesthetics. Rituals survived technological advancement. Because monarchy thrives on continuity. Even when central heating quietly solves the problem, ceremony keeps the drapes. There is something oddly poetic about that. The medieval queen fighting cold with wool and faith would hardly recognize the comfortable palace of later centuries. But the posture of bedtime, the careful retreat from public to private, remained intact. So, as we drift toward the close of our long winter journey, picture the gradual thaw of history. Stone giving way to paneling. Arrow slits replaced by windows. Fires supplemented by innovation. The queen's breath no longer visible in the air. Her hands no longer chilled beneath linen. The castle did not vanish. It evolved. It softened. It learned. And somewhere along that slow architectural path, royalty discovered something revolutionary. Sleep without strategy. Sleep without constant negotiation with the elements. Sleep that was simply sleep. As the final embers fade from our imagined medieval chamber and the first hints of modern warmth settle into palace walls, we can almost smile at the persistence of those earlier queens. Wrapped in wool, surrounded by drafts, enduring. Because despite everything, the cold stone, the political marriages, the whispered superstitions, they slept. Night after night, winter after winter, and now, as you settle deeper into your own far warmer surroundings, perhaps with heating that does not require servants or burning coal, you can appreciate the quiet luxury of steady warmth. No arrow slits, no rattling shutters, just calm. History, after all, has done the shivering for you.
Let's drift back into the medieval world of arranged weddings, political alliances, and marriage nights that were far less romantic than the paintings suggest. This is not a story of passion. It's a story of paperwork, with lace sleeves. In medieval Europe, marriage among royalty was not primarily about love. It was about land, treaties, alliances, and occasionally preventing wars that everyone was too tired to fight. If the kingdoms wanted peace, they did not send flowers. They sent a daughter, preferably young, healthy, and genetically useful. Because nothing says long-term diplomacy like handing your 14-year-old to a foreign court and hoping for the best. Let's begin gently with Margaret of England, daughter of Henry III, who married Alexander III of Scotland in 1251. She was 11, he was 10, which means their wedding night was, thankfully, more symbolic than practical. Medieval society understood biological timing to some degree, so consummation often waited until the bride reached puberty. But the ceremony itself, that happened promptly, because alliances could not wait for adolescence to finish stretching. The wedding celebrations were lavish. Nobles feasted, musicians played, chroniclers wrote enthusiastic accounts, and somewhere in the background were two children, dressed like miniature adults, trying to behave with dignity while likely wondering when they could go back to something resembling normal life. Of course, normal life for royalty meant tutors and political expectations, but still. Now let's float to France. In 1396, Isabella of Valois, age 6, was married to Richard II of England, who was 29. Yes, 6. The marriage was arranged to secure peace. During the 100 Years' War, Isabella was sent to England with dolls and attendants. The marriage was ceremonially completed, but consummation was postponed. One hopes everyone agreed that this was wise. Richard reportedly treated Isabella kindly. He understood she was a child. Their union was political theatre, yet even without physical expectations immediately imposed. The symbolism was heavy. A 6-year-old girl became Queen of England, crowned, paraded, displayed. Her childhood refrained, entirely through diplomatic necessity. Now, if we gently increase the age just a bit, we encounter marriages that were expected to be consummated swiftly because heirs were urgent. Let's consider Catherine of Aragon and Arthur, Prince of Wales, married in 1501. Catherine was 15, Arthur was 15. A neat symmetry. Their marriage lasted only a few months before Arthur died. The question of whether their marriage had been consummated became a matter of enormous theological and political debate years later. Catherine insisted it had not been fully completed. Henry VIII, when he later wanted an annulment, argued the opposite. Because of course he did. The technical details of one teenage wedding night became the foundation for England's break with Rome, which is perhaps the most dramatic outcome of adolescent awkwardness in European history. Let's slow down and breathe a little. Because these nights were rarely romantic, often they were supervised, at least ceremonially. In some courts, nobles escorted the couple to bed. Blessings were offered, curtains drawn, and then the expectation. The pressure was immediate. Produce an heir, preferably male, quickly. A bride's value, unfairly and relentlessly, was tied to fertility. If months passed without pregnancy, whispers began. Physicians were summoned. Advice was given, sometimes bizarre advice. Medieval medicine was confident, if not always accurate. Now drift with me to Spain again. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had a marriage that eventually became politically powerful and personally cooperative. But even they began as two young rulers navigating expectations. Their union in 1469 was secret at first, conducted without full parental approval. A rare hint of autonomy in a world dominated by arrangement. Yet even in this case, dynastic pressure hovered nearby. Their partnership reshaped Spain, but it began with the same quiet reality every royal couple faced. Shared bed, shared duty. Let's glide northward. In Scandinavia, royal marriages were equally strategic. Margaret I of Denmark married Håkon VI of Norway at age 10. Again, the ceremony occurred early, with consummation delayed. She later became one of the most formidable rulers in Northern Europe, effectively governing Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. It's fascinating how often young brides, introduced into foreign courts as political tokens, matured into decisive leaders. Perhaps early exposure to pressure builds resilience, or perhaps it simply forces adaptation. Now, we cannot discuss medieval marriage nights without acknowledging the emotional strangeness of it. Imagine meeting your spouse for the first time days before your wedding. Language barriers common, customs unfamiliar, food different, climate colder or warmer than expected, and then being told that the stability of two kingdoms rests gently on your ability to produce a healthy infant. No wonder anxiety was common. Let's float softly to the Byzantine Empire. There, imperial brides often underwent elaborate selection processes. Prospective impresses were sometimes paraded before the emperor in a formal bride show. Imagine it, standing in silk, evaluated not for wit or humor, but for physical health and suitability. Romance, but make it bureaucratic. Once chosen, the wedding was magnificent. Crowns. Incense. Gold mosaics glowing in candlelight. And beneath all that splendor lay the same quiet expectation. Continuity. Heirs. Stability. Even when affection developed later, the first nights were structured, ritualized, heavy with symbolism. Love, if it came, arrived slowly. Sometimes it never did. Let's pause gently on one more example. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Married in 1770. She was 14. He was 15. Their marriage was not consummated for several years. Whether due to shyness, physical hesitation, or mutual awkwardness, historians still debate. But the result was intense scrutiny. Satirical pamphlets circulated. Public patience thinned. A bedroom delay became a national conversation. Eventually, children were born. But the early years shaped public perception. A private hesitation magnified into political weakness, because in monarchy, nothing is truly private. And that is perhaps the soft, steady theme running through all these stories. Marriage nights were not just personal milestones, they were state events. The bed was not merely furniture, it was infrastructure. So as the candles dimmed to night, picture the vast stone castles, the heavy tapestries, the echoing corridors quiet at last. Two young figures sitting on opposite edges of a very large bed, strangers, technically, bound by treaty, watched by history, not tragic, not romantic, just profoundly human. All right, the wedding feast has faded. The musicians have packed up their lutes. The candles are shorter now, and somewhere inside a stone chamber, two newly married royals are discovering that the real pressure begins after the ceremony, because in medieval courts, the clock started ticking immediately, not metaphorically, quite literally. People were counting. If a queen did not announce a pregnancy within a year, whispers began. If 2 years passed, whispers turned into polite concern. By year 3, that concern had a distinctly diplomatic tone. Letters were written, alliances reconsidered, because without an heir, especially a male one, the future became hazy, and medieval people disliked hazy futures. Let's float back to Catherine of Aragon. After her marriage to Henry VIII began warmly, she did conceive several times, but most pregnancies ended in tragedy. One son lived only a few weeks. A daughter, Mary, survived, but Mary was not the son Henry desperately wanted. Catherine endured the quiet grief of repeated loss, layered with the increasingly visible disappointment of her husband. Imagine the isolation. You are queen, crowned, respected, and yet your value is reduced to biology. Henry's anxiety grew theatrical. He convinced himself the marriage was cursed. That divine judgment explained his lack of sons. Instead of accepting chance or medical limitation, he sought annulment. Because why sit with discomfort when you can reorganize your entire church system? Thus began England's break from Rome, a deeply theological revolution, rooted in dynastic frustration. Now let's glide to France again. Anne of Austria, wife of Louis XIII, experienced a similar strain. Married in 1615, she did not produce a surviving child for over 20 years. 20. Courtiers speculated. Alliances trembled slightly. And then, finally, in 1638, she gave birth to the future Louis XIV. The relief must have been almost physical. A kingdom exhaling. But imagine those 2 decades. Every month observed. Every rumor amplified. Anne's marriage to Louis XIII was distant, formal. The emotional warmth was limited. Yet she bore the burden of expectation publicly and repeatedly. Let's drift south towards Spain and consider Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad. Her marriage to Philip the Handsome was politically brilliant. Habsburg meets Spanish royalty, a powerhouse alliance. Philip, charming and charismatic, attracted admiration easily. Joanna fell deeply in love, perhaps too deeply. When Philip's attention wandered, as it often did, Joanna's jealousy intensified. After his early death, her grief became consuming. She reportedly refused to part from his coffin for extended periods. Whether her behavior stemmed from genuine mental illness or political manipulation by male relatives eager to sideline her remains debated. But what's clear is that dynastic marriage did not guarantee emotional stability. In fact, it often magnified emotional vulnerability. Now let's float to the Habsburg world more broadly. Their obsession with keeping bloodlines pure resulted in marriages between cousins, uncles and nieces, close kin across generations. The logic was simple: preserve territory, consolidate power, the biological consequences were less simple. Charles II of Spain again serves as the quiet, tragic emblem. His parents were uncle and niece. His family tree resembles a circle more than a tree. His health was fragile from childhood. His marriages produced no heirs. The court prayed. Physicians consulted horoscopes. Remedies were attempted. Nothing worked. And when Charles died childless in 1700, Europe politely erupted into the War of Spanish Succession. Because an empty cradle in Madrid meant contested claims everywhere else. It's almost soothing how predictable it was. No heir equals chaos, not dramatic chaos. Bureaucratic, multinational chaos. Let's drift back to England once more. Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, married Philip II of Spain. She longed for a Catholic heir to secure her religious restoration. When she believed herself pregnant, the court prepared enthusiastically. Months passed. Her abdomen swelled. Hope grew. And then no child arrived. A phantom pregnancy. The emotional toll must have been immense. The political embarrassment equally heavy. Her body had promised stability, then quietly withdrawn it. In medieval and early modern Europe, medicine offered explanations that ranged from herbal mixtures to moral speculation. Queens were advised to rest more or less, to eat certain foods, to pray to specific saints. Fertility became both spiritual and medical theater. Let's gently widen the lens beyond Europe for a moment. In the Ottoman Empire, the production of sons was equally central. But there, mothers of princes could gain significant influence. The valid sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, wielded power within the palace. So childbirth was not merely survival. It was advancement. Yet the system carried its own anxieties. Multiple sons meant potential succession conflict. Some periods institutionalized fratricide to prevent civil war. It was structured, regulated, almost administrative, which makes it somehow more unsettling. Though we won't linger on that tonight. Back in Europe, the absence of heirs could reshape succession entirely. Consider Queen Elizabeth I. She never married, never produced children. Her childlessness created decades of speculation. Suitors proposed, Parliament nudged, she declined. And while her reign was stable, the question of succession hovered until her final years. Her decision not to marry avoided immediate dynastic pressure, but it did not eliminate it. It simply deferred it. When she died, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the crowns peacefully, but the uncertainty beforehand was palpable. And so we return, softly, to the central image. The medieval marriage bed, large, ornate, draped in fabric, symbol of alliance, engine of continuity. Inside that bed were two human beings, often young, often strangers, navigating private vulnerability beneath very public expectation. Some marriages warmed over time. Some remained polite. Some grew cold. Some exploded quietly into scandal. But nearly all were measured first by one metric: heirs. If a son arrived, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang. Stability felt tangible. If only daughters arrived, joy was more restrained. If no children arrived, tension thickened. It is strangely calming, in hindsight, to see how much depended on such fragile beginnings. Empires leaning on biology, wars prevented or triggered by worms, political systems balanced on the hope that an infant would survive childhood. So, as we let the castle quiet again, imagine the months passing, courtiers glancing discreetly at the queen's figure, letters traveling between kingdoms with coded inquiries, physicians offering tonics, priests offering blessings, and to individuals, perhaps holding hands in the dark, hoping their bodies cooperate with history. All right, the months have been counted, the prayers have been whispered, the court physicians have offered their confidently incorrect advice, and now, slowly, the air in the royal bedchamber begins to change, because sometimes the air does not rive, sometimes affection thins out, and sometimes the people, bound by treaty and gold embroidery, simply do not like each other very much. Let's float gently back to England. Henry VIII. Of course we must begin with him, because when a medieval marriage went cold, Henry did not quietly endure it. He reorganized reality. After years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and no surviving son beyond infancy, Henry convinced himself the union was divinely cursed. Never mind that they had once been fond of one another. Never mind that Catherine remained loyal, intelligent, and steady. Henry's attention shifted to Boleyn, and suddenly theology became personal. He requested an annulment. The Pope hesitated. Henry grew impatient. And instead of accepting no like a mildly inconvenienced monarch, he decided England should simply have its own church. Because why negotiate when you can found a new religious structure? The marriage dissolved. Catherine was set aside. Anne was crowned. And an entire kingdom shifted. Faith traditions, because one royal relationship had grown uncomfortable. Now, let's drift to France. Louis XII married Jean of France, a gentle and pious woman. The marriage was arranged when they were young, but Louis later sought annulment, claiming the union had never been properly consummated. Convenient timing, since he wished to marry Anne of Brittany for strategic reasons. Jean, by most accounts, had been dutiful and kind, yet political advantage outweighed personal loyalty. The annulment was granted. Jean entered religious life. Louis remarried. Diplomacy continued. Let's gently shift to the Iberian Peninsula. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile had been political partners and, by most accounts, respectful collaborators. But not all Spanish marriages were so cooperative. Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile began with intense attraction. Philip was charming, handsome, As his nickname boldly insists, Joanna was deeply devoted, perhaps too devoted. Now let's float north to Scotland and England again. Mary, Queen of Scots, married first to Francis II of France, a short union due to his early death. Then she married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was handsome, ambitious, temperamental. The marriage quickly deteriorated. Darnley demanded. Authority Mary resisted. Trust eroded. And then we have Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine. Not medieval, but fitting in spirit. Napoleon adored Josephine passionately, yet she failed to produce a male heir for him. Despite deep attachment, he divorced her for dynastic necessity. He needed continuity. Josephine understood. Their separation was sorrowful, but strategic. Love bowed politely to legacy. Let's float briefly to the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Leo VI married 4 times in pursuit of a male heir. 4. Each marriage layered with theological controversy because the church frowned upon repeated unions. But Leo persisted because an emperor without a son invited uncertainty. Eventually, he secured an heir at the cost of religious tension and personal reputation. And so the pattern continues. Marriage begins with ceremony. Hope. Diplomacy, then reality settles in. Personal incompatibility, infertility, political ambition, emotional distance. Sometimes couples adjusted quietly, lived parallel lives. Separate apartments within the same palace. Public smiles. Private indifference. It was efficient, if not warm. Other times, separation occurred through annulment, exile, or quiet neglect. Queens retired to convents. Kings remarried. Children were repositioned within succession lines like careful chess pieces. What feels strangely constant is the emotional compression. No one was allowed to unravel loudly. Royal disappointment had to be dignified, publicly restrained. Even when hearts fractured, faces remained composed in portraiture. So imagine the bedchamber again. Once hopeful, now colder, curtains drawn, to figures lying apart. Silence where conversation once flickered. No dramatic storms, no shouted confessions, just distance. And outside those heavy doors, advisors waited, watching, calculating, ready to convert private unhappiness into political opportunity. All right, the marriage has cooled. The bedchamber has grown politely silent. Somewhere down the corridor, in a nursery draped with embroidered saints and slightly drafty windows, a child has arrived. Or perhaps several, because even strained marriages often produced heirs. And those heirs absorbed everything. Royal children did not grow up in neutral air. They breathed in tension. They sensed distance. They watched their parents interact like diplomatic representatives rather than affectionate partners. And even if they did not fully understand it, they felt it. Palaces echo, after all. Let's drift back to Henry VIII's children. Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, each born into a different phase of their father's emotional life. Mary witnessed her mother Catherine cast aside, declared illegitimate, removed from her household. Imagine being a child and watching your mother's status dissolve publicly. Mary carried that wound into adulthood. Her later religious intensity, her need to restore Catholicism, perhaps rooted partly in loyalty to her mother's suffering. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, experienced a similar reversal. When Anne fell from favor, Elizabeth was also declared illegitimate, sent away from court, raised cautiously, observing everything, learning early that royal affection is conditional. As queen, she would guard her autonomy fiercely because she knew how quickly favor turns. Edward VI, the long-awaited son, grew up fragile and heavily tutored. His childhood was structured and solemn, surrounded by Protestant reformers shaping his worldview. He was king at 9, a boy ruling a kingdom while likely still preferring quiet study to political maneuvering. His early death shifted succession again. The emotional instability of his parents' marriage rippled. International uncertainty. Now let's float to France. Louis XIV, born after 2 decades of his parents' childless marriage. His very existence felt miraculous. He was treated as such, carefully protected, intensely observed. His mother, Anne of Austria, doted on him. The court invested in him. And, as a child, he experienced the trauma of the Fronde, when nobles rebelled and the royal family fled Paris. That experience shaped him deeply. He associated instability with noble independence. So, as king, he centralized power, built Versailles, controlled court ritual meticulously. A childhood shadow turned into architectural strategy. Let's glide toward Russia again. Paul I, son of Catherine the Great and Peter III. His upbringing was complicated. After Catherine seized the throne, Paul grew up knowing his father had been removed. Rumors swirled about Peter's death. Catherine kept Paul at a distance politically. Tutors raised him carefully, but he sensed exclusion. As emperor, Paul became suspicious, rigid, obsessed with military discipline, perhaps overcorrecting for the instability of his youth. He reversed many of Catherine's policies simply because they were hers, a son reacting to her mother's dominance, royal psychology playing out on imperial scale. Now drift softly to Spain. Philip IV's children were born into a court already shaped by Habsburg inbreeding and heavy expectation. The most famous, Charles II, inherited not just genetic fragility, but the emotional atmosphere of a dynasty desperate for continuity. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was both parent and regent. Protective to a fault, Charles grew up physically weak, socially sheltered, and politically symbolic. He became a living reminder of dynastic excess. It's interesting how often these children were either overprotected or emotionally isolated, rarely balanced. Let's float north to Scotland again. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, experienced childhood upheaval. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was forced to abdicate when he was an infant. He grew up separated from her, raised by regents, educated intensely, taught early that monarchy required performance and caution. As King of England, James valued intellectual debate, wrote extensively, commissioned the King James Bible, but he also struggled with insecurity and political friction. A childhood of displacement rarely produces effortless confidence. Now let's soften the pace and consider the Ottoman princes again. Raised within palace walls, separated from public life, intensely educated, some formed close bonds with their mothers. Others grew wary of siblings who might later become rivals. In certain periods, succession struggles cast long shadows over their youth. It was a childhood of privilege wrapped tightly in awareness. And yet, within these structured environments, glimpses of ordinary humanity persist. Letters between royal siblings reveal teasing affection. Diaries mention favorite pets. Tutors describe moments of laughter during lessons. Even heirs raised under enormous pressure found small pockets of normalcy. Still, the weight was constant. From infancy, they were addressed with titles, treated as symbols, their illnesses recorded meticulously, their progress in Latin or horsemanship evaluated politically. Imagine being praised not for personality, but for potential. Some adapted with grace, others developed eccentricities. George III of Britain, raised with strict moral guidance, valued domesticity and routine. He appeared stable and devoted to family life. Yet the immense responsibility of kingship, layered atop personal health struggles, created complexity. Royal childhood does not shield one from vulnerability. Let's float briefly to Prussia. Frederick the Great endured a harsh father who valued military toughness above all else. Frederick preferred music and philosophy. The tension was palpable. Punishments followed. Emotional distance hardened. When Frederick became king, he ruled efficiently, but retained a lifelong preference for intellectual companionship over domestic warmth. Childhood disapproval leaves quiet marks, and so the pattern returns. Marriage strain produces children shaped by silence, by tension, by whispered arguments behind thick doors. Those children ascend thrones carrying emotional blueprints formed in drafty nurseries. Some become cautious, some become controlling, some seek affection desperately, Others avoid it entirely, but beneath the crowns, they remain human, still reacting to early wounds, still craving stability, still remembering how it felt to stand at the edge of a grand hall while adults negotiated their futures. So, as the palace quiets again tonight, imagine the nursery lights dimming, a young prince staring at the ceiling beams, a young princess listening to distant footsteps in separate apartments. They do not yet know the full weight of the crown, but they feel its outline. Now we arrive at the final quiet chamber. The children have grown. The tutors have stepped aside. The crown sits heavy but familiar. And at last, the heir who once listened to strained footsteps outside the nursery door now stands at the edge of their own marriage. This is where the circle either breaks or completes itself. Some heirs walked toward marriage determined not to repeat what they witnessed. Elizabeth I of England chose the most radical solution of all. She chose not to marry. After watching her mother executed and her father cycle through wives like political strategies, Elizabeth understood the dangers of dynastic intimacy. Marriage, for her, meant vulnerability. It meant yielding power. It meant potentially reliving instability. So she transformed herself into the Virgin Queen, symbolically married to her kingdom. It was not merely political theater. It was emotional strategy, a refusal to step into a structure that had wounded her childhood. Others attempted gentler reforms. Louis XVI of France entered marriage shy and uncertain. His union with Marie Antoinette began awkwardly, even innocently. They were young, inexperienced. For years, their marriage remained unconsummated, whispered about across Europe. Yet unlike many royal couples before them, there was an effort at companionship. They shared private jokes, simple hobbies, domestic moments at the petty Trianon. It was imperfect, politically disastrous in the end, but there was an attempt at warmth, however fragile. Then there are those who unconsciously repeated everything. Paul I of Russia, shaped by suspicion and emotional distance, entered marriage with rigidity. He demanded discipline, order, structure. His relationships reflected control more than ease. The instability he felt as a child hardened into strict expectation as an adult. The cycle quietly continued. In Russia, Frederick the Great avoided deep romantic attachment altogether. After a forced marriage arranged by his father, he maintained emotional distance from his wife. They lived largely separate lives. He poured himself into music, philosophy, and governance. A childhood of criticism had taught him that vulnerability carried risk. So he protected himself with intellect and routine. Sometimes the repetition was almost invisible. George III of Britain, however, stands as a contrast. Having been raised with an emphasis on moral steadiness, he entered marriage with Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz and, by many accounts, built genuine affection. They shared numerous children. Domestic life mattered to him. He cultivated an image, and perhaps a reality, of family devotion. It did not erase his later struggles with illness, but it suggests that not every heir was destined to echo cold corridors. Some sought warmth deliberately, and then there is the quiet truth we rarely consider. Many of these royal couples learned affection slowly, not in dramatic, poetic bursts, but in small routines, shared meals, private conversations away from court eyes, inside jokes no ambassador would ever record. Because once the ceremony ended and the political observers left, two human beings remained, often young, often anxious, often carrying the invisible luggage of childhood tension. Marriage, for them, was both stage and shelter. And perhaps that is the softest revelation of all. Royal love was rarely cinematic. It was negotiated, pressured. Observed. But within that structure, human tenderness sometimes survived anyway. Not because it was easy, but because people, even crowned ones, crave connection. So as our candle burns lower, and this final chamber grows dim, imagine generations layered atop one another. A father who ruled coldly, a daughter who chose solitude, a son who demanded order, a queen who sought companionship, each responding differently to the same inherited blueprint. Some broke the pattern, some repeated it. Some quietly reshaped it without ever announcing a revolution. The palace walls witnessed all of it. And now, as we close this final door, we leave them where history leaves everyone, somewhere between power and vulnerability, between duty and desire, between inheritance and choice. Good night.